Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Anju Narayan, retired Associate Professor from Delhi University. Today we shall take up the module titled This Theory Evolved in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's contradictory to the objective ideas of new criticism and formalism. Some of its major proponents are Norman Holland, Stanley Fish, Wolfgang Iser, Hans Robert Joss, David Bleach, and Roland Barthes. And some of their important predecessors are I.A. Richards, Louis Rosenblatt, and C.S. Lewis. Now, the emphasis of this theory is on subjectivity. As we delve into the subject further, you will realize it for yourself. Now, there are 5 categories of reader response theory. We can list them as 1. Transactional reader response theory, 2. Affective Stylistics, 3. Subjective reader response theory, 4. Psychological reader response theory, and 5. Social reader response theory. Let us begin with the first category, which is transactional reader response theory. Its main proponents are Louis Rosenblatt and Wolfgang Iser. As Tyson writes, this theory analyzes the transaction between text and the reader. Rosenblatt says a text offers both openness and limitations. Also, an analysis of this openness and limitations reveals transaction with the reader and differentiates between the efferent and aesthetic reading, and differentiates between the efferent and aesthetic reading. And last but not least, aesthetic readings uphold determinacy and indeterminacy. Wolfgang Iser says, firstly, potential gaps within each literary text which a reader can pervade according to his or her imaginative capability. He distinguishes between implied reader and actual reader. Implied reader responds to a text as per the text expects. Actual reader brings his own private experiences while responding. Now let's take a look at the second category, which is affective stylistics. Now this was recognized by Stanley Fish. This theory contradicts the idea that the meaning of a text is within it. According to him, meaning is present within the reader, and meaning is attained by time and how the text affects its reader in the process of reading. The third category, subjective reader response theory. This was established by David Bleach. He draws attention to written responses by the readers. According to him, the texts are made by the responses of readers, and their interpretations give meaning to the text. He differentiates between real objects and symbolic objects. He emphasizes the physical presence of a real text and the conceptual development. And according to him, the conceptual development after reading a text is symbolic. The fourth category, psychological reader response theory. This was promoted by Norman Holland. According to him, a reader is not independent of his or her own motives towards reading a text. So, according to Norman Holland, interpretations and responses made by a reader express his or her own psychology. He describes identity theme as a planned way of balancing between the psychological conflicts and coping strategies. Now, 3 stages of interpretation process are suggested by Norman Holland. They are: the first stage, defense stage. The text brings a shield in the minds of the reader. Next is the fantasy stage. The reader tries to calm down those defenses by finding a suitable way of interpretation. And then there is the transformative stage, which is an abstract interpretation to attend the intellectual interpretation of the text. The 5th and the last category of reader response theory is social reader response theory. This is covered in the later works of Stanley Fish. Here he talks about the subjective response to a text from an individual to a community. He promotes the concept of interpretive community. Now, by interpretive community, we mean individuals who have common interpretive strategies. Now, by interpretive strategies, we mean common strategies are essentially products of various sorts of established assumptions. A reader may belong to more than one interpretive community at a time. Fish also claims that interpretive strategies are not infinitive, and, I quote, interpretations will always be controlled by the relatively limited repertoire of interpretive strategies available at any given point of time in history, unquote. To conclude, I would like to say that it's not a single theory or a single way of looking at a text. Multiple approaches by which a reader can analyze a text, and a reader's own disposition and creativity allows him or her to assign meaning to the text. So in other words, ways of reading can never be appropriated. Now we move on to Wimsatt and Beardsley. Fallacies. What do we understand by fallacy? Fallacy is a deceptive way of understanding or analyzing a text. The origin of this word comes from Latin fallacia or phalanx, fallacy meaning deceiving. Wimsatt Jr. and Monroe C. Beardsley, they belong to the school of new criticism. The 2 essays written by them on this subject are as follows. 1, the intentional fallacy, and 2, the affective fallacy. They abandon the ideas of both authors' intentions and readers' subjective reactions to a literary text as effective way of analysis. Let's try to understand what is intentional fallacy. To begin with, it critiqued the concept of analyzing a work by making assumptions on the intent of the author. Secondly, that a poem comes out of a head and not a hat is not adequate, because poet's intellect being the reason of a poem does not necessarily mean that the poet's intention has to be the criteria. Thirdly, a critic can never find an answer to the poet's actual intentions. Fourthly, poetry does not need to be interpreted by the means of intention because they are different from practical messages. Fifthly, even though The meaning of a poem is personal. The views and approaches towards the poem should be attributed to the dramatic speaker. And lastly, the author's true intention can never be achieved by him in the poem because it's always abstract. Wimsatt and Beardsley suggest that a poem belongs neither to the poet nor to the critic. The author has no control over its meaning. It's a possession of the public who understand them by the means of language. Therefore, knowledge constructed by the poem becomes objective knowledge. Wimsatt and Beardsley disagree with Richard's idea of a poem being a class of experience, which the poet has contemplated, and that a poet can also be a reader. Two types of evidences Wimsatt and Beardsley mention: internal and external. Now, paradoxes of internal being public and external being idiosyncratic. Internal evidences consist of grammatical structure of a poem and habitual knowledge of the language. External evidences comprise of information regarding the conditions or reasons for the poet to write a poem. Third kind of evidence is also there, and that is the personality of the poet. Internal evidences are most consistent and reachable. At the same time, they are available to everyone because they are part of the public knowledge. External evidences are not much accessible to the public. Biographical evidences enable the readers to understand how potentially a poet can utilize the words, the language. And the concept of allusion created by author's notes is dangerous. Notes can be misleading as they can make the readers go outside the main text. Thus, there will be attempts to understand the intention of the author. Now we'll move on to the second essay by Wimsatt and Beardsley, titled Affective Fallacy. According to Wimsatt and Beardsley, a reader's emotional or personal response towards interpreting a text can be misleading. I quote, "The intentional fallacy is a confusion between the poem and its origins, a special case of what is known to philosophers as the genetic fallacy. It begins by trying to derive the standard of criticism from the psychological causes of the poem and ends in biography and relativism. The affective fallacy is a confusion between the poem and its results, that is, what it is and what it does. It's a special case of epistemological skepticism, though usually advanced as if it had far stronger claims than the overall forms of skepticism." Unquote. The impact on a reader's psychology by a poem leads to impressionism. As a result, the objectivity in the poem disappears. A successful interpretation of a text does not depend on its powerful or emotional impact on readers. Emotions vary with respect to different functions of a text, even though the objects or actions towards which they are brought out are same. The essay criticizes the belletristic traditions of analyzing a text as faulty because of their dependency on subjective impressions. Literary criticism, depending on emotional effects, will be susceptible to confusion and uncertainty. The response of the readers towards a text is neither to be accepted nor rejected, because they contribute nothing towards the objective criticism of a text. The emotive knowledge produced by the subjective readings may contain some aesthetic value, but they cannot form the principle for understanding a text. Emotive quality of a poem is within its objectivity. They assign a complex structure to this emotive object. Both Wimsatt and Beardsley assign a complex structure to this emotive object and state that it can be recovered at any point of time if a reader is willing to do so. I quote, "In short, though cultures have changed and will change, poems remain unexplained, and there is no legitimate reason why criticism, losing sight of its durable and peculiar objects, poems themselves should become independent of social history or of anthropology." Unquote. Wimsatt and Beardsley were rejected by the reader response critics. Reason being that it ignores the potential of a reader to render meaning to a text. Fish calls it affective fallacy. The objective nature of a text is nothing but an illusion because the self-sufficiency and completeness that a text possesses eventually threatens the movement it may contain. So to put it in a nutshell, the two essays consider the text itself a unique entity and support the objective reading of a text. They reject the necessity of both author and reader to determine the meaning of a text. A literary critic's responsibility is not to report about a poem, but rather to explain its meaning objectively without influencing the text by author's intent or his or her own response towards it. I hope I've been able to help you to understand this module, and if you have any queries, you can always go to EPG Pathshala website. Thank you.